Hi, everybody. So this is the third of the lectures that will catch us up, sort of. And what it is entitled Urban Bishops and Rural Ascetics in Early Byzantine History. So what I want to do with this one is just to show the ways that in the rural countryside, holy men, and in this urban city centers, which are very numerous in the East compared to the West, bishops really took over a lot of the traditional roles filled by pagan elites. So that's where we're going with this. And we already did a lot of it when we talked about Daniel the Stylite, but the thesis that I really want to emphasize here is to show that when you're thinking about how society operates on a very local scale, in cities, bishops have a lot of the power. In the rural countrysides, in the early Byzantine period that we're talking about here, the holy men do. And they overtake the traditional pagan. So I'm going to share the screen and illustrate this. So here we are. And I'll put this PowerPoint up just like I'm doing with the other ones. Map. Very crazy map. See, aren't you glad that you didn't have to do this one? Although a lot of yours read a little bit like that, a little bit even harder. So mostly we're just focusing on Byzantium today, although I'm going to compare and contrast a little bit with the West, how the structure of religion is different from the East on the local societies. And so this part, the ascetics, I already did. We just talked about the origins of asceticism and what an ascetic is. I gave you examples of Meliana the Younger, and just to illustrate. I wanted to also just say that asceticism begins in Syria. That's where it really is a trend. Syria is a lot less hostile of an environment than parts of Egypt. And so what happens in Egypt with the ascetic tradition is that monasticism forms, because people really don't, like, you could be Simeon the Stylite and crawl up to the top of a pillar, and although you have to have people, give you your food, it's an environment that you could survive. You can't go like out beyond the confines of the Nile River by yourself in Egypt, all by yourself as easily. And so communities of ascetics were formed. So a big example of this is St. Pachomius. St. Pachomius is famous. He had been a soldier, and he set up communities that were actually called villages, and they were some of the first monasteries. So I just wanted to point that out because I didn't do it as much last time. Well, I want to talk about how these places where holy men existed and where monasteries existed became centers of power, centers of arbitration, so that they're not just doing religious things. And when we talked about Daniel, one of the things I really wanted to get across is that although he's a religious leader, he's not just doing religious things. I mean, those healings, he might have been doing them from his religious miracles or whatever, but the people wanted healing. I'm going to go into more examples of that. So the years we're talking about, 400s and 500s. This is the age of the holy men in Byzantium. And the holy men, when I say holy men, now I'm talking about the hermits, like they're just individual. The idea is that because they have such a lack of attachment to worldly things, they are higher up morally, and they become moral leaders because they are so detached from the world. So people go to them for judgment. Examples: St. Anthony is one of the most famous of the hermits, and he was called a doctor to all Egypt. So that's just an example of not just Daniel the Stylite. So doctor to all Egypt. In other words, he was serving the needs of the people of Egypt. And yes, he did so through a religious lens, but in all kinds of ways. You already know about Simeon Stylites. Here's a picture. Simeon! That snake, it's tempting Simeon. Guess who wins? I like how he has his knees drawn up to his chest. So Daniel was very influenced by Simeon. Simeon was known as the Simeon Stylites. A stylite is a pillar saint. How did you know before you took this class that you'd learn a word like that? Like stylate. Oh, the type of person who climbs up onto a pillar and stays there as a saint. Well, apparently there's so many, they invented a word. So Simeon Stylites, an example I want to give that wasn't in the reading of Daniel is once there was a certain tradesman and he cursed this tradesman's enemies in Antioch. So that's an example. Like he got involved in a trade dispute. Simeon also heard lawsuits. Simeon even sanctioned water rationing. So in his miracles, it's very some examples of secular affairs, things that are definitely not just about religion that he got involved in. And we see this too with Daniel the Stylite. So we'll talk more about this, but I do want you to pay attention to how Daniel is involved in worldly affairs, even though he's supposed to be the least worldly of people. It's really fascinating. These duties that the holy men performed supplanted the traditional function of the village patron, which had been existing in the Roman world. It was disappearing as a result of the third century crisis, where many of the richest people were going into the countryside, founding big mansions and having latifundia with tenant farmers. In the West, this happened much more completely. In the East, there were still independent peasants and villages, and the village leaders weren't as important. Holy men became more important. Unlike the village leader, the holy man got his authority from God. So that, is kind of like going to win over a village leader who just has tradition on his side. So he was very popular, the holy man thing. The thing that's really unique about the holy man tradition is that the holy man was not educated. And so you have people that really have a great deal of power, unlike the bishops, unlike the senators, no education. So Daniel didn't even speak Greek, and here he is like talking to the emperor. The emperor has to have, well, actually in the reading, you might remember the emperor is able to speak Syrian and talk to Daniel, but Daniel can't talk to him. The pagan aristocracy, this is so radically different because in ancient Roman history, the aristocracy that were pagan, they made a point of equating their education with their morality and their classical training. And so they pushed back against this holy man tradition. Before St. Augustine became Christian, because he had to deal with feeling like he was going down lowbrow before he converted. And what he was complaining about is, I'm going to quote here, the uneducated rise up and take heaven by storm, and we, with all our learning, here we are, still wallowing in flesh and blood. So he's kind of like self-hating there because he was super educated, and he's noticing that the Christians, from a very uneducated background, had assumed certain types of leadership. Well, I'm going to talk about bishops mostly in this lecture. And I'm going to try not to go on too long because I know that you've already heard a lot of me. See, I'm in a different shirt just to flavor it up a bit. Okay. So in the East, cities are really important. In the West, there's not too many cities. So bishops, because they become leaders of the cities, they're really, really important. And they're important in Western Europe, but they're really important in the Byzantine world. And so just like the holy men supplanted the village leader, bishops supplanted and took over what the senatorial aristocracy had always done. And they did this in the same years that we're talking about. So like 400s and 500s. But unlike the holy men, after 600 or so, there's the Muslim invasions and the rise of the holy men tradition fades out. The bishops continue to have incredible power throughout the whole period of Byzantine history. So you already know that bishops are organized around dioceses, which were originally created as a kind of political unit by Diocletian. So the word diocese was originally a secular term. The Christians used those same borders to organize their religious units. And still today, in the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Episcopalian Church, the world is organized into these diocesan units. So it was a very handy thing to have for administration. It's one of the things that Constantine and later emperors definitely benefited from, because if you have a pre-existing administration, it's just clearer to get your edicts pronounced. So every diocese was governed by an archbishop. And then in the diocese, wherever there were cities, would be a bishop. In fact, in like a lot of parts of Western Europe, you qualify as a city if you have a bishop. So they became synonymous. So this was a really good way for the emperor to get his rule from, wherever he was ruling out into the urban centers. And if you're the leader of Christianity and the bishops are going to do your will, that's a helpful thing. You do need to know about the 5 most important bishoprics: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch. So these are the most important. And what you're going to notice off here is that there's only one in the West. Everything else is in the East: Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch, the most important archbishops in Byzantium, versus Rome, the only one in the West. And this is important for figuring out why Western Europe develops a bishop out of Rome that eventually claims religious leadership and eventually over all of Christianity. We'll come back to that theme. So these bishoprics in the Byzantine world were not always in accordance with each other. We talked about how with the Robber Council had been condemned by the Council of Chalcedon because they were fighting over the Monophysites. So, it's a problem because it creates disunity in Byzantium. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the secular power of the bishops, because it's, of course, they're spiritual leaders, but they have an awful lot of secular duties that had been performed by senatorial aristocracy. And I'm going to give you a kind of list. So feel free to stop as I go along, because these are ones you should know. What were the bishops doing for their communities? Okay, here we go. Alms distributed for the poor. Using church money to build huge basilicas. And this replaced the pagan temples. The basilicas were the property of all Christians. So you could be totally poor and go into the most important buildings of your community. They were incredibly sumptuous. So it's like you could see the wealth, and even if you couldn't afford your food, you in some ways participated in that kind of community sense of possessing that church because it was for you. Other types of charity included burial services for the poor. So now I'm on number 3. Burial was very, very important for Christians, and it's a status thing. It's not just a spiritual thing, but so to be buried properly, important. If I have time, I'll talk more, but Byzantium is where hospitals were invented, and the bishops were the ones that built hospitals. So they built hospitals for people that were poor, people that had leprosy, and other people's needs. So those are the main thing. The alms could include giving some money, but also food and clothing to the poor. So that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And it really explains why maybe so many ordinary people would have found Christianity compelling. That's where they can have their social safety network. And these bishops were giving this stuff and doing this stuff, not just to Roman citizens, but to everybody that was Christian. And that shows a real changeover from, let's say, the 2nd century, before the 3rd century crisis. So that's really a big deal. And I wanted to show you that. So this transfer of power that happens, I want to go on. So I'm still more about this point, the new role in the 4th century and beyond. It happens after the 3rd century crisis. And there were still a lot of pagan schools that were very important, like in Alexandria. As the bishops continued to get power, by the late 4th century, many of these schools, like the School of Athens, eventually was closed down. The School of Alexandria was closed down. There's a really famous pagan martyr called Hypatia, and she was a Neoplatonist who had Christian and pagan friends, and she was murdered by a Christian mob really under the direction of the Archbishop of Alexandria. So it's a sign of things changing by the late 300s to become religiously intolerant. So I'm going to give you an example of the power of bishops. And here is an example coming from Alexandria. I'm going to list off some of the wealth that this archbishop had. And, you know, it sounds to me almost like a Chinese warlord in the age when, you know, the different dynasties would have dynastic collapse when they would exist. Or it sounds almost like a mafia center with the amount of different types of power that the archbishop controlled. So by 418, the Bishop of Alexandria was able to handpick all the leaders of the artisan guilds. So that's like kind of a not trade unions because it's misleading, but you'd have to join a guild in order to be doing a certain craft. And that's obviously really important mercantile activity in the city. And the bishop could pick all those leaders. The Archbishop of Alexandria commanded a handpicked force of 500 men. That's like an army. And they were supposed to be, they were the stretcher bearers at hospitals. They were militia. And actually, the town council of Alexandria complained to the emperor about this 500 men that were stretcher bearers because they were so powerful. They were feeling, some of the people of Alexandria felt intimidated by them. Sometimes bishops were unpopular, but really they effectively ran the cities of the Roman world. So to conclude, I just want to give a comparison between the Byzantines and the West, what's developing after the Roman world collapses in the 5th century. Because the main thing I want to say here is that the cult of the holy, or the holy man tradition, doesn't really take off in the West. While bishops have a lot of power, take my early medieval class, we'll learn about it. But on the other hand, in the West, monasticism becomes more important. There are communities of holy people. And a lot of the monasteries get a focal point around a saint. So you have a holy man or a holy woman, but they're dead. And it's just very quirky how this unfolds because, you know, the idea is that these saints that became figureheads for saints cults, they're supposed to be so powerful beyond the grave that they have an active exerting will. And yet, of course, I mean, who gets to decide what that will is? Lots of times it's the monasteries that decide, like, oh, look, this Cuthbert really wants us to do blah, blah, blah. So I just wanted to give you a kind of example of how the kind of religiosity and the way that leadership operated on a local scale in Byzantium differed from the Western half of the former Roman Empire. And there's still really important with the bishops, but there's not a holy man. And instead, the cult of the saints becomes more important. And I should say, though, asceticism is really important in the West. It's very important in the monastic tradition, not as important, I mean, in the bishops. So that kind of thing that where, you know, you have starving yourself and you have hair shirts and you do all the hard things to show that you're not really attached to this world continue among the monks. Let's see if I have any pictures. Oh, so this is just a Western example of ascetic because it's the tunic of St. Francis of Assisi. And when we all are allowed out of the country, we can go to Italy and see it today because it's still, the cult of St. Francis or the followers of St. Francis are still very much going to Assisi to pray to his shrine as a kind of religious pilgrimage. Here's Meliana the Younger. It's not a contemporary picture, but she's considered very important. And I'm just showing you these to illustrate that there's kinds of remnants of the old style of civic leadership that still continue. Like there's still consuls. Consuls had been existing since the Roman Republic, and there were still consuls. And here's some Roman games. And by the way, these animals are not eating the people because that was not allowed after Constantine, just an FYI. I also think it's really cool to just illustrate about Byzantine art because it's really changed from the kind of heyday of Roman realism. In Byzantine art here, you can see that the more important figures are physically larger. And then you kind of see the spaced out eyes, like the individual expressions aren't as real. And there's a kind of abstraction, like the consul Ariobarzus presiding over the games, and then you see some games of these people arranged in a circle, and they don't look, that rainbow thing doesn't look like stadium seating, but that's what it's supposed to represent. And I showed you this last time, a modern stylite. And so Julia Butterfly Hill is a ecologist. I think she did this back in like 1990 or something, living on a tree. All right, thanks for your patience, and I'll see you all on Tuesday. We'll have a quiz on Julian the Apostate. And also, I'll put all of these PowerPoints up. Let me stop the recording.